Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into your analysis of The Rings of Power, specifically episode 6 of season 2. You've got some really interesting takes, especially regarding the show's faithfulness to Tolkien's world. And lucky for us, expert speaker is here to help us unpack it all.
Well, it's always fascinating to see how these beloved stories, translate to the screen. There's certainly a lot to dig into with this episode, so let's jump right in.
Okay, so you mentioned feeling kind of meh about this episode, which is a big change from your excitement about the last one. And a lot of your notes focus on how the show handles or maybe mishandles its source material. What's the big takeaway here?
Yeah, adapting something as complex and as beloved as Tolkien's work, well, it's a real challenge. And you're right, this episode took some pretty big swings, some definitely more successful than others.
One of the things you called out right away was the trailer. Did it give away a little too much? I mean, come on, that whole Galadriel and Sauron thing. Did we need to see that beforehand?
Suspense is so important in storytelling, and I think knowing what's coming can really diminish the impact. It's like reading the last page of a mystery novel first. You might still enjoy the journey, but that element of surprise is gone.
Totally. Now let's talk about those deviations from the source material. You had some strong reactions to the show's take on the creation of the Rings of Power, particularly their purpose when it comes to men.
This is a really crucial point, and your analysis really gets to the heart of it. The show seems to miss this fundamental aspect of Tolkien's lore, the idea that the ring's power to preserve things would have disastrous consequences for men. It would sort of trap them in this stasis, unable to fulfill their natural destiny.
So it's not just about men wanting to hold on to power, it's about how the rings would fundamentally alter their very being.
Exactly. Tolkien was very clear that men are bound to fade, and that's a good thing. It's part of their unique journey. The show seems to gloss over this a bit, suggesting that the rings were at some point intended for men, which just doesn't track with the lore.
It's like the show is saying, hey, here's a magical artifact that will grant you immortality, but don't worry about the existential crisis that comes with it.
Right. It's a pretty significant oversight, and it kind of speaks to this larger pattern of the show making choices that, while maybe interesting on the surface, don't quite track with the deeper, themes of Tolkien's world.
Which brings us to another element you had a strong reaction to, that sea dragon. It sounds like you have mixed feelings about this new addition.
It's definitely a head-scratcher. Now, Tolkien's world is vast, and it's entirely possible that creatures like sea dragons could exist within it. But it's the way the show uses this creature that feels a little off.
So the existence of a sea dragon, not totally out there, but it's how it fits into the world, specifically Numenor, that has you raising an eyebrow. What's the disconnect there?
Well, Tolkien portrays the Numenorians as incredibly sophisticated, right? They are master shipbuilders, architects, explorers. To think they'd resort to, like, chucking people to a sea dragon as punishment feels incredibly jarring. It's like finding out, a cutting-edge tech company still uses an abacus for accounting.
That's a hilarious image. Okay, so we've got this advanced civilization resorting to incredibly barbaric methods, and that actually ties in another point you made about Numenor, the whole Muriel situation. One minute she's being tossed overboard, the next she's back in charge. What's going on there?
Yeah, it's a plot point that left a lot of viewers, yourself included, kind of scratching their heads. The show hints at this political turmoil brewing in Numenor, but this rapid, switch in power feels very unearned.
It's like they just skipped over a whole act of the play, like
Yeah.
they're missing those crucial scenes where we see Muriel rally support, outmaneuver her opponent something to explain such a drastic change in her situation.
Right. It really undermines, I think, the complexity of Numenorian politics that Tolkien so carefully crafted in the books.
And speaking of complexity or the lack thereof, let's talk about Adar. You brought up this fascinating point about his decision to let Sauron just walk away. I mean, what was he thinking?
Yeah,
Seriously.
it does seem like a glaring oversight for a character who's been presented as, cunning and calculating up until this point.
It's like keeping a venomous snake as a pet and then just being like, you know what? I'm just going to release you back into the wild. Not exactly a sound strategy.
Right. And, we could interpret it as Adar underestimating Sauron,
Right?
maybe misjudging his true intention.
So, like, Adar is so focused on his own goals, on creating a home for his orc children, that he maybe doesn't fully grasp, like, the scope of Sauron's ambition.
Precisely. Or it could be that Adar has, a deeper plan in motion, one that maybe involves using Sauron's own schemes to his advantage. It's unclear at this point, but the show definitely needs to address this to give us more insight into Adar's motivations.
Yeah.
Because,
Because right now it feels a bit like the writers needed Sauron back in play, and this was the most convenient, if not entirely convincing way to do it.
yeah,
Speaking of questionable decisions, we have to talk about, these powers that be that are forging the rings of power. It's like they completely skipped over the chapter on the potential downside of powerful artifacts.
it's a valid concern. You would think Celebrimbor, the master elven smith, would be a bit more cautious, especially when it comes to, crafting objects of such immense power.
Right. It's not like they're just making some fancy silverware here. These are the rings of power, for goodness sake. And it's not just the elves, right? The show has the dwarves involved, too, and they should know a thing or two about the dangers of greed and ambition, considering what's happening with their whole mithril situation.
Exactly.
You'd think someone at some point would raise a hand and say, hey, guys, should we maybe think this through a bit more?
Yeah, like consult the historical records on what happened the last time someone tried to create objects of immense power.
Just a thought. But hey, maybe that's for another episode. Speaking of head-scratching moments, we have to talk about Gandalf. Or should we say, the not-so-jolly version of Tom Bombadil.
Ah, yes. The curious case of the Blue Wizards.
Hmm.
It seems the show is taking some liberties with their arrival in Middle-earth. Like, for those less familiar with the lore, the Blue Wizards, according to Tolkien, were Maiar, spirits similar in nature to Gandalf, sent to Middle-earth to oppose Sauron. But
And their story's shrouded in mystery, right? Tolkien never really elaborated on their specific deeds.
exactly. And that leaves the showrunners with a lot of room for interpretation. Now, the character who arrives in, this fiery crash, it's heavily implied to be Gandalf, but his demeanor, his powers, it seems a bit off, doesn't it?
He's like a grumpy, amnesiac Gandalf who just walked out of a Michael Bay film.
A very apt description. Now, it's entirely possible that this is Gandalf, just not the Gandalf we know and love from, later ages.
He could be significantly changed by his experiences in this era.
Right. But then there's the other Gandalf, the one the Harfoots encounter, the one who sings that song about fire.
And that song, so eerie. It's like a lullaby written by a pyromaniac.
It's definitely unsettling. And the way this character interacts with the Harfoots, his strange powers, it all points more towards Tom Bombadil than Gandalf.
Tom Bombadil, but he's this, like, enigmatic, almost whimsical being in the books. This guy is all brooding intensity.
Right. It's a pretty radical departure from the Tom Bombadil we meet in the books. But I think that's what's so fascinating about these interpretations. Are we seeing these characters at different stages in their very long lives? Are they kind of reflections of Tolkien's world warped by the show's own creative lens? I mean, it really raises more questions than answers.
Which, let's be honest, seems to be a recurring theme with this show. But I have to admit, those unanswered questions, those moments where the show veers off the beaten path, they make for some really intriguing discussions.
Absolutely. I think it's what makes, engaging with these adaptations so rewarding. We get to revisit these beloved stories, see them through these new lenses, and have these, really thought-provoking discussions about what works, what doesn't, and why.
Could have said it better myself. Big thanks to expert speaker for joining us on this deep dive into Middle-earth. And to our listeners, we want to hear from you. What did you think about this episode's departures from Tolkien's lore? Did they enhance your viewing experience or leave you scratching your head? Let us know your thoughts. Until next time, happy deep diving.